On this video, we will be discussing about the submandibular triangle or the digastric triangle. It's called the submandibular triangle because sub means below and mandibular is the mandible. So this triangle is located below the mandible. And it's also called the digastric triangle. It's because the borders are formed by the digastric muscles. First, the landmarks and the borders. For the first landmark, the mastoid process. Second is the styloid process. Third one is, of course, this one, the mandible. And lastly, the hyoid bone. Now remember, this is called the digastric triangle. It's because its borders are formed by this important muscle. This is called the digastric muscle, and more specifically, this muscle is the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. As you can see, its origin is the mastoid process of the temporal bone, and it inserts to the intermediate tendon of the hyoid bone. It is supplied by the occipital artery and innervated by the facial nerve. Now, the next muscle is called, this one is the anterior belly of the same muscle, the digastric muscle. Now, its origin is the digastric fossa of the mandible, and its insertion is the intermediate tendon that is connected to the hyoid bone. It is supplied by the facial artery and innervated by the mylohyoid nerve, which is a branch of the trigeminal nerve, particularly the V3. Now I'm in the position to tell you the borders of the triangle. First, the superior border. It is formed by the inferior border of the mandible and the line connecting from the mastoid process to the angle of the mandible. The next border is the posterior border, which is the posterior digastric belly. This one. And the anterior border is the anterior digastric belly. This one. Now the floor of the triangle. Two muscles form the floor of the triangle. This is the first one. This is called the mylohyoid muscle. The mylohyoid muscle, as you can see, it originates from the mylohyoid line of the mandible and it inserts to the body of the hyoid bone. It is supplied by the mylohyoid branch, which of the inferior alveolar artery, and the submental artery. And it is innervated by the mylohyoid nerve. Now, this second muscle, as you can see, this one is called the hyoglossus. The hyoglossus, its origin is from the greater cornu of the hyoid and it inserts to the sides of the tongue. It is supplied by the lingual artery and the facial artery, and it is innervated by the hypoglossal nerve or the cranial nerve 12. This is the floor of the triangle. Now let's proceed to the roof of the triangle. The roof of the triangle is formed by the deep cervical fascia. So here, I just improved my drawing a bit and let's proceed to the contents of the triangle. I will discuss 14, but let's first proceed to the first one. The first content is the submandibular gland. It is partly below the mandible and partly deep into the mandible, which is the posterior part of the mandible. There are two parts, as you can see. The first one is the superficial arm, and the deep one is located in between the hyoglossus and the myoglossus. The gland is connected to the Wharton's duct or the submandibular duct, and it drains to the base. This duct drains to the base of the tongue. Now, That's our first content, the submandibular gland, which is supplied by the facial and the lingual arteries and drained by the facial and the lingual veins. Now it is supplied by the superior salivary nucleus in the parasympathetic side, which means it's responsible for the secretion of saliva, and for the sympathetic innervation, it's indirect. It actually comes from the vasoconstriction of the arteries that supplies it, the submandibular gland. The next content is the Wharton's duct. The Wharton's duct is also called the submandibular duct, and it drains to the base of the tongue. Now, this is called the external carotid artery, and one of its branches goes into the submandibular triangle. This is called, the third content is the facial artery. It comes from the external carotid artery and it goes behind the mandible. Then it goes laterally to the inferior border of the mandible in close relation to the submandibular gland for which it supplies it. And as you can see, it has two branches, two important branches, which is the one that goes up supplying the parts of the face and also the another branch which is the submental artery. This one is the submental artery. Coming from the different tributaries, we have the fifth content, which is the facial vein. It crosses this region superficially lateral to the mandible and posterior to the facial artery, and it unites with the anterior retromandibular vein to become the common facial vein, and more superficially, it crosses the posterior digastric muscle and it drains to the internal jugular vein. Note that the facial vein is posterior to the facial artery. The sixth structure is the Ranine vein. It passes medial to the digastric belly and it drains to the common facial vein. And later on, I will show you that it is below the hypoglossal nerve. This is called the hypoglossal nerve, which is the seventh structure. The next structure is the lingual nerve. It passes the superior part of the hyoglossus and hooks beneath the submandibular duct, and then it goes to the tongue. Now that's the lingual nerve. The next structure is this one. This is called the submandibular ganglion. The submandibular ganglion is suspended by two nerve filaments from the lingual nerve. Our next structure is a branch of the external carotid artery, which is called the lingual artery. Initially, it goes upwards and medial and then goes downwards and then forwards. It is important to note that anatomically, it is more medial to the hyoglossus, and or in this diagram, it's behind the hyoglossus, and then eventually it goes upwards to the tongue. Our next structure is the mylohyoid artery, which is a branch of this artery. This is called the inferior alveolar artery of the maxillary artery, and its branch is this one. This is the mylohyoid artery. And also another structure is its mylohyoid nerve. Our second to the last structure is a group of lymph nodes, or we can call it sublevel 1B lymph nodes or the submandibular group of lymph nodes. Our last structure is the lingual vein or the lingual veins. It accompanies the lingual artery as seen in the diagram, and eventually it forms a single trunk, and then this single trunk drains to the internal jugular vein. In summary, The borders are the following. The superior border is formed by the lower or the inferior border of the mandible and the line that connects the angle of the mandible to the mastoid process. And the posterior border is the posterior digastric muscle. The anterior border is the anterior digastric muscle. The floor is formed by the mylohyoid muscle and the hyoglossus. And its roof is formed by the deep cervical fascia. Now, the contents are the following. First is the submandibular gland and the Wharton's duct. The next one is the facial artery, and then the branch of the facial artery, which is the submental artery. And then after that is also the facial vein and the Ranine vein. And then after that is the hypoglossal nerve, this one, and the submandibular ganglion and the lingual nerve, this one. And next one is the lingual artery, this one, the mylohyoid artery and nerve, the submandibular gland, and the lingual vein. Now that's it. I hope you learned a lot from the illustration.